I know this sort of in the back of my hand. Sorry, it's not just like the notes or something like the game. I'm just going to write what I know. Just is that what that we dissected. I know. Oh, is that it? Yeah. I know. Yeah. Yes, we do.
Hi, Claire.
I've been done. That's what I know. Like on Thursdays. I know, like 9, 8, I'm like, I'm ready.
Okay, we've got 12:30, so why don't we get started? Good afternoon, S&P. Wow, that's very enthusiastic. You know what I'm going to say? I'm going to say great news, as I always do. And what's the great news? Exam, right. The exam is on Friday. And so for a third time, we'll just briefly go over this, about the format. You will have the entire period for this. Mostly short answers is the kind of thing. TED-Ed would be a good thing to practice. I've also posted many of my PowerPoint lecture notes. You've seen the videos and so forth. You might review the consciousness questions and look over the ones that we've spent some time in class especially. Okay, you might be asked to take in some information and apply what you've learned to that new information. Maybe read a news article, maybe read an abstract or something along these lines. This, by the way, is available on Blackboard and also on the S drive, so you don't have to take all of this down. We'll spend some time, really in all of our sessions, practicing, but I'd like to have some student-on-student practice, especially today, because this will be our last day before the first exam. Not worth a lot of points, right? Only worth this 40. These 40 points, small fraction of the overall grade. But anyway, it gives us a feel for how we're doing on the material. So looking forward to that great news. Friday's going to be exam day. Okay? All right. Why don't we jump right in? As always, we try to make 2 steps forward across our 50 minutes, but we'll do 1 step back first. And then we'll talk a little bit about theories of perception. And our orienting question is, why do things look as they do? First, can somebody remind us about the 2 broad answers to that? Why do things look as they do? Okay, Madison's got something.
Because the world is as it is.
The world as it is, yeah.
And then our brain.
Okay, and then our brain is as it is, right? So those are 2 ways of thinking about this. And of course, some researchers approach more with an environmental focus, and they look really at what's in the stimulus and what kinds of information can the world provide to us, and others are looking at in great detail what goes on inside of the brain. And of course, those two make the field a very, very rich field indeed. Okay, so what I'd like to do is not go through all of the different questions that we had the other day, but there are a couple that we didn't quite get to, but these are still questions that we were answering through TED-Ed for Monday's class. We didn't quite get there. We were doing some reading by Dr. Harry Heft, and he was citing a few different researchers, including James Gibson. And one of the important ideas in Gibson's writing, as summarized by Dr. Heft, is the idea of affordances. Okay, so there was a TED-Ed question on that. I think you might have gotten some feedback on that one. Can somebody help us out with the idea of affordances? What is meant by that? Okay, Alex has something.
They're features of the environments that are relative to an individual organism's way of life.
Okay, features in the environment relative to an individual organism's way of life. Very nicely stated, okay? So the idea is that we might all be sharing a particular environment with very different kinds of species, and the environment might be affording or providing functional opportunities. That's a nice, succinct way of thinking about affordances. Functional opportunities that are actually very specific to a particular organism, sometimes a particular species. So there might be all kinds of energy in this room that you and I are not sensitive to, but that energy might provide functional opportunities. That's our synonym, functional opportunities, to maybe a bee. A bee can see wavelengths of light that you and I can't see. A bird can see wavelengths of light that you and I can't see. There are animals that can directly detect electrical fields. Sharks can do this, right? So they can pick up on electrical fields that are in this room, even though you and I can't. That might provide the shark an opportunity to navigate toward a target. And you and I can't see that, but that's something that's actually in the environment that is an affordance for the shark, but maybe not an affordance for you and I. So it's a functional opportunity, and then it is dependent on a particular organism. You can even have members of the same species that have, in this case, maybe different sensory capacities. Young children, they're fun to watch for a lot of reasons, but really, really young ones have terrific hearing, and they kind of orient their heads to all kinds of things that I know I can't hear, and it might even be true that you can't hear those also. Okay, so affordances, we can think of those as functional opportunities for a given organism. Okay, all right. Another main idea from Gibson is the idea of change and action. Anybody want to help us out with what Gibson was getting at there, as relayed by Dr. Heft in his summary? Change. Okay, Claire's got something.
Change and action are relative to each other, and that change is always going to promote an action from the animal, and that action is probably going to contribute to another change in the environment.
Okay, right. So there's a certain relation between change and action, and it's certainly the case that the environment itself is always changing, and certainly many organisms move through their environment. And this is something that might not have come out entirely clearly, but I'd like to maybe clarify, I think, an important point in this topic of change, and especially action. There are many, many researchers like me that study the visual system by very carefully controlling a stimulus, putting it on a screen, and getting a response. And sometimes the image is on the screen only for 200 milliseconds or something shorter than that, so that we can control eye movements. We have a lot of controllability here. The problem with that is that's not really the way we see in everyday life. Many of us know about the distinction between internal validity and external validity. Right? We want to be able to say that our experiments can generalize beyond the laboratory. And Gibson was very good at pointing out that psychophysicists, going all the way back to Weber and Fechner, were pretty good at getting good control over their stimulus and drawing inferences about that stimulus and what people can do with it. But in the real world, stimuli don't typically last for 200 milliseconds. They last for much longer. People aren't typically sitting looking at a computer screen. They're up and they're moving around. And so they bring a very dynamic approach to the study of perception. They want to know, especially, what can we do, or what can a visual system do to promote action? So there's an action-perception link that's very critical for people like James Gibson, right? As opposed to somebody like me, for example, where I typically am just looking at what I might call raw sensations. I don't really care what you can do with those sensations. I just try to measure them. And I think that they might inform me about how your visual system is operating. So if you want to know how a system works, you might have a whole lot of internal validity. If you want to know what a system is for, you might try to emulate some environmental conditions. You might want to emulate some evolutionary conditions, and you're looking at how the organism is acting in its environment. So you're bringing in a lot of dynamic stimuli. You're looking at how the animal moves through its environment. So I think we alluded to last time, eyes, for example, are very metabolically expensive. They burn a lot of oxygen. Okay? So how do they pay for themselves? Well, it might be the case that way back when, the animals that first began to develop some kind of eyes, roughly defined, were able to get food at a greater rate than those who didn't. Okay? So it might be the case that even limited vision provided an animal with a great opportunity to go out and grab some energy, and that may have paid for itself. Yes, eyes are metabolically expensive, but if they help us get to food at a greater rate than our expenditure is for that metabolic process, then it's a good trade-off. So Gibson is always here to remind us about the importance of perception and action. Okay? That's one of his main themes. Yesterday, Meg began to give us an answer to question 14, but just because we're at that point in our sequence of questions, I thought I'd go over question 14 again, maybe ask if somebody other than Meg, who did it well for us yesterday, can distinguish the proximal stimulus from the distal stimulus for us. It's an important idea, proximal stimulus versus distal stimulus. Okay, next.
The proximal stimulus is like a sensation, while the distal stimulus is the actual source of the sensation.
Okay. Okay, right, so the distal stimulus is the actual source. And this might help. The distal stimulus is very informally out there in the distance. Okay, so my voice is out here in the distance. I'm physically separated from you. Okay, if you're looking at this screen is out here in the distance. Okay, at a slightly closer distance might be something like the pen that you're using and the paper that you're using, but it's still at a distance from you. Okay. What is proximal is when, say, light is traveling and it hits one of your receptors, and now all of a sudden the reflections from the screen, or from my body, or from this table, or from your page, hit your retina. Now all of a sudden we have something very close to you. In fact, it's on you. It's up. It's near you. It's proximal to you. Okay. So this is the pattern of stimulation on your receptors, and that is driven, of course, by the distal stimulus. And so when people begin to understand perception and draw theories about perception, they need to make very precise measurements, sometimes about what's out here in the distance. We might call that the physics. And then what are the receptors actually getting? You know, what's actually hitting the retina? What's actually hitting your eardrums? It's very interesting when we think about the complex of acoustic energy that's hitting your eardrums. My voice would be the distal stimulus for that sound that you're hearing, but the pattern of stimulation on your eardrums would be the proximal stimulus. And we'll learn that that's a remarkably complicated stimulus, and yet somehow we can unpack it very easily. We can be in a very crowded room, and we can understand that somebody is having this conversation, somebody else is having this conversation. We can sometimes follow both of them, even though it's all a jumble on our eardrum. Okay, so we'll learn a little bit about how we unpack that. Okay, so that's proximal versus distal stimulus. The last issue that we had was trying to distinguish unconscious inference from structuralism given a particular video. And this was the Ted Adelson video, which is one of the three I think we didn't show last time. So why don't I see if I can get the Adelson video going. And some people have already seen this. It was one of our TED Ed questions, so hopefully everybody's seen it, but we'll take a look one more time. we've all seen that before. So I wonder if somebody can help us out in whether we think that demonstration better supports an interpretation that we might say is a structuralist interpretation or unconscious inference. What do we think? Okay, thanks, man.
I said unconscious inference because it's kind of we're making reflexive and immediate inference that they're actually in different tones of gray when moving further on observe it and for the situation we realize that they're the same.
Okay. Okay, all right, so that seems reasonable. Somebody else have a different take on that, or would like to say more about that? Yeah, thanks.
Even if we can rationally say, oh, I know these two are going to be the same code, it still appears to be different just because of the unconscious inference.
Yeah, perhaps because of the unconscious inference. At least that's what Helmholtz would have us believe. And of course, Helmholtz didn't see this exact demonstration. But on other kinds of demonstrations like that in his day, he did infer that there must be some kind of unconscious inference that goes on. So let's see if we can now connect that to two other terms that we had up here the other day. We had top-down and bottom-up. Can somebody help us out with that distinction, top-down and bottom-up, just what that distinction is, and then we'll see if we can apply that here. Yeah, thanks.
So top-down is knowledge-driven.
Okay.
And bottom-up is stimulus-driven.
Okay, thanks, Gabby. Right, so bottom-up is stimulus-driven, top-down is knowledge-driven. Okay. Not to put you on the spot, but to put you on the spot, which do you think maybe better pertains to what's going on here?
So when you look at the shading, you're kind of stimulus-driven.
Okay, if you're looking at the shade, there's a sense in which you're stimulus-driven, right? Okay.
But then to know that it's actually the same color, you have to have a knowledge.
You'd have to have knowledge. You'd also have to have knowledge. We have some knowledge of how checkerboards work. There's a pattern here, right? It's supposed to go dark light, dark light, dark light. It doesn't matter how you cut it. You can go this way and it's dark light, dark light. You can go that way and it's dark light, dark light. Right? So there's a pattern here, and when this movable item is in, if you will, a light position, well, we see it as light, right? And when it's in a dark position, we see it as dark, right? So we're sort of picking up on more than what's just coming from the image itself. It always has the same luminance, but we have this notion that maybe it's supposed to be, in the pattern, right? So we're now taking a much broader piece of information and presumably using that to come to some kind of conclusion about what level of lightness is actually out there. Also, we have this complication of the shading, right? So we might say, well, shaded objects, we'll have to discount that. And we don't say that directly, but it seems to be built into how we're experiencing that. Okay, so a very compelling illusion, the Adelson illusion. Any questions about any of that? Okay, why don't we go on to the TED-Ed for today, and we'll see if we can do this. We'll go for about 15 minutes on this, and I want to reserve the final 20 minutes to have you first generate some possible test questions for each other, and then share test questions with each other. I think it's a great way to review, and just to make it a little bit more interactive. But we haven't used the random number generator in a while, so I thought I'd use the random number generator, and also give you an idea about the questions here. So these are the questions that you answered for today. And we're still on the broad topic of theories of perception. And we're still trying to address this question, why do things look as they do? Okay, so that's our orienting question here. And we began to come to some more recently developed ideas about an answer to this question, why do things look as they do? One of them, at least relative to structuralism and relative to Gestalt psychology, is the information processing approach. And I wonder if somebody can think about how they responded to that question and share their answer with us. We'll see if we can go with a random number generator here to try to get away from my bias if I have a bias on just calling on certain people. Somebody stop me. Okay? All right. Zach is out. I've already answered a question too, but just to honor that, did you have an idea about information processing theory?
What was the question again?
So the question, again, why don't I project it here, it's this idea of still under the broad rubric of why do things look as they do. Oops, sorry. Here we are. Okay. Briefly describe the so-called information processing approach to perception.
So I guess there was just that. I'm not exactly sure what that
Okay, it's all right. If you're not entirely sure, I kind of caught people. Not everybody has their responses right in front of them, so that's quite all right. Anybody want to handle the information processing? Information processing project. Okay, yeah. Thanks, Abby.
We observe, or like we process all the information that we get from our environment.
Okay, well, it's that's certainly a rephrasing of what's going on here, right? Okay, they develop certain kinds of analogies in information processing. Okay, why don't we go with Sarah and then with Jake?
I had that it was an approach used in cognitive psychology to try to understand how humans process information. And the analogy they used was that we are like a computer.
Okay.
So our mind like takes the information, organizes it, and stores it for later use like a computer does. So it compares the way we process information to the way the computer processes.
Okay, yeah, that's a main idea, right? So there's a similarity in the information processing approach between, if you will, human brains or the brains of any animal, right, and what a computer might do. And there might be some relevant similarities there. Jake, did you want to add something to that?
Just a kind of a mechanical process, try to describe it in your senses.
Yeah, and it's often one box to the next box to the next box. We had something like an information processing diagram when we talked about time estimation, and we said that we had like a pacemaker over here, and it puts out certain pulses, and then there's an accumulator box that counts those pulses. That might be gated by an attentional box, and then maybe we have a memory box over here where we pull out longer-term memories of certain durations, like a duration of 5 seconds or 10 seconds, and we make some comparisons there. I think Alex also had a hand up, but maybe we covered all of that.
I was basically saying, in short, the mind is a program run by a machine brain.
Okay, yeah, it's very much like a machine brain, and just different boxes for different kinds of processes without getting into any biological detail just at that moment. Okay, all right. Why don't we do a couple of others from this before we still have some time before we want to break into groups. So maybe I can get a larger picture there. We're going to see if we can have you generate here a couple of examples of artificial intelligence from everyday life that hopefully pertain to sensation and perception. Right? So, yes, please.
I don't know if this is what you were looking for, but I talked about, I know this is the case for like some buildings and some rooms here, and also in my high school that we had like a lighting system that would detect whether there was movement or not in the room. Okay. And like after like a period when there like wasn't like 10 or 15 minutes, if there wasn't any like motion whatsoever, the lights would just shut off.
Okay, really good. Really good. So there's a type of intelligence there. Wouldn't it be cool if maybe in the old days we wanted to save electricity, so we would have somebody walking up and down the hallways looking in the rooms when there was nobody there, turning the lights off. Right? But now we can have an artificially intelligent system make that decision for us based on the absence of motion over a specified period of time. Okay, so that works really well. They have to detect, is there motion there, and then they're going to turn the light off. That works really well. Some other examples of, okay, what is this?
Like if someone wears like a Fitbit or like a lot of cell phones count steps, so
okay.
It monitors your motion and like it'll monitor how many flights of stairs you go up, and some things will even give you the amount of calories you burn.
Okay, really good. Okay, so we're getting a lot of information. Again, there's some sensation that goes on there, right? Because if I'm wearing a Fitbit, it's maybe picking up how I'm rocking back and forth, right? It's got some sensitivity to that. Maybe it has one or more accelerometers that pick up my own gait, my own walking structure, and it makes an estimate of how many steps are there. Do you have something, Alexa?
Yeah, I was thinking of Siri, like on an iPhone.
Okay.
How you can talk to it and it'll like hear you,
yep.
but like process what you said and come up with an answer.
Yeah, please.
I was thinking of a camera, like how it's able to see things and then store it to memory.
Okay, all right, yeah, so a lot of our current electronic cameras can hold huge amounts, right, and store them. Also, they can kind of focus in, right, in the same way that our retinas are able, we get a focused image on our retina because we have a lens, and we're going to learn all about lenses next week that does some focusing for us. But a lot of the cameras now do that, and they also have this image stabilization, so that even if your hand is wobbling a little bit, it figures out, they really want, a picture of Claudio, and that's going to be the target here, even if the person's going like that. Several other hands went up. Was Sarah? Okay. Some other things. Yeah.
There was something on Facebook how when you try to tag someone, it will prompt you, and like sometimes you can say like for facial recognition of like, or say like for me and my twin, it'll give me both our names because it recognizes our similarity.
That's really cool. First, it's cool that Facebook does that, and I was aware of that. I hadn't talked to any twins about that. And so, if you don't mind my asking, so if it's either a picture of you or your twin sister.
Both of us. It's never just
Okay, and I didn't remember, you probably told me 3 times. Are you identical twins?
Yes.
You are identical twins, okay. All right, and so can we all show by gesticulation, when she and her sister are on Facebook, and we're using an artificial intelligence system, if we were to measure Facebook's D prime for distinguishing Meg from Meg's sister, can you show me by gesticulation what that would look like? That's great. Okay, yeah, everybody's got it, okay? So we can measure the sensitivity of that system, okay? And then you could arbitrarily set it up and say, well, if we get, maybe it could be biased toward Meg, or it could be biased toward Meg's sister, right? Okay, all right. Pretty cool. So many of these. By the way, somebody mentioned phones. I'm just really excited about what's going to be happening with, is it iPhone 6 that's coming out? I'm told that the surface is going to wobble in a way that you can't see. But does anybody know what's going to happen on the surface of the iPhone 6? The claim is this: it's going to wobble very, very quickly over a very small distance, and when you run your finger over it, you will have a compelling sensation that your finger is moving down into a groove or up over a bubble. So it's flat as a pancake, like this thing is, but you get the sense like, oh, I'm on a blip, or I'm on a dimple, right, going up or down. Okay, and so they're simulating, just by using simple vibrations, what your fingers would have experienced had they been going up or down, what we might call a convexity or a concavity. And more on convexities and concavities later on, how we perceive those. But really cool that it's a physically flat surface, but we get that kind of sensation. We'll see if it works. That's one of their selling tools for iPad or iPhone 6. Okay, we're off to Alan Turing. Has anybody seen the Alan Turing movie? Go ahead. Do you remember any highlights from that?
I just remember that it was like, it kind of showed how he was really socially awkward and a lot of his ideas were rejected, and he actually had to work really hard to get people to believe that he could make a machine that was faster, but he did it.
Yeah, he did it, right.
It's a really good movie, actually.
I thought it was fantastic. Yeah, I really wanted. You had seen it?
The Imitation Game.
Yeah, the Imitation Game. Right?
I guess along the same vein, like it was just it made me think more about like the way that the movie ended, and I guess towards like the sexuality of Alan Turing, and like why that ended up destroying his mind. I guess.
Yeah, sure.
The treatment of it. I'm sure.
There's so much going on in that movie. There's a lot of personal tragedy. There's a lot of we can see how far we've come as a society on certain social issues. There's tremendous mathematics and the exigency with which we have to get a response to the attack from the other side. It was really, really very well done. Anybody find some other fun historical or biographical facts about Alan Turing? Gabby's got some.
He was an ultimate distance runner.
He was an ultimate distance runner. I think they allude to that in the movie, right? We see him as a young boy running. Okay. Anything more on that?
It was like Wikipedia said he used to run 40 miles to London for like a meeting to give a presentation or something.
Okay. Pretty cool. Yeah, go ahead, Alex.
He was invited to be a part of the Baker Street Regulars, which is a literary society that's Sherlock Holmes fandom that has Truman was in it, Ian Fleming, Isaac Asimov, and Christopher Lee.
Oh, wow. Wow, wonderful. Okay, so it's always fun to put these folks into historical context. So we're talking about artificial intelligence. We're talking about this new iPhone. And so much of that, even though Alan Turing didn't talk about that specifically, none of that would be possible without his contributions and the famous Turing test. Would somebody want to describe the Turing test? Or maybe some of you know about the so-called Chinese room from philosophy. If you've taken a philosophy course, there's something very similar, the Chinese room and the Turing test. But either of those, somebody want to help us out with that? Okay, thanks, Claire.
The Turing test is sort of like if we as humans are able to distinguish whether or not person, or if we're talking to a human being, or if we're talking to a machine based on their answers to questions.
Okay, right, yeah. So it's very much, you can see how artificial intelligence is getting started, right? They've got you maybe in one room, and you're able to submit a question somehow to an answerer on the other side. And that answerer might be a human person who will slide out an answer on a piece of paper. You slide a piece of paper in, it has a question on it that you wrote, they slide a piece of paper out. And the issue here is, can you distinguish about whether there's a person answering your question or there's a machine answering your question? And the notion there is, if we get to the point where you can't distinguish a machine-based response from a human-based response, we've made a lot of progress, and those are functionally equivalent. Right? So now it's performing the same functions that a human would have had. And as we talk about Siri and other kinds of artificial intelligence systems, you can see that this Turing test is being realized at greater and greater levels of success in so many different aspects of our lives. Okay? All right, so we've kind of already hinted at functionalism. I think I'll skip over that one and do something that's related to that, which is question 6. These ideas were very much, at least related in my mind. So I wonder if somebody can help us out in understanding how the Turing test relates to the well-known biological distinction between so-called genotypes and phenotypes. Kind of gets to the issue of functionalism. Genotypes and phenotypes. Okay, we'll go with Zach and then Alexa.
Okay, I guess I would say the genotype codes for the phenotype, but just knowing information about the phenotype doesn't guarantee you anything about the genotype. Okay. In the same way, you could have, with the Turing test, you could have the appearance of someone, like a human talking to you, but you can, at the same time, it could just be a computer with that passive Turing test.
That's right.
You wouldn't have any, you wouldn't have a guarantee about the actual identity of the person that's giving you the answers.
Excellent. Okay, then really, really good. Alexa also had a hand up. Did you want?
Yeah, that is essentially it. But just like a genotype is like the actual genetics that go into making a person, and a phenotype, or like whatever they're making, and a phenotype is the physical expression of those genes.
Yeah.
So
right.
In a computer, it wouldn't necessarily be genes, but like whatever goes into making the computer is like different from what the physical expression of that might be. Okay, really good. Yeah, these are all just right on target. Very roughly, we might also think a little bit here about cause and effect. And one of the ideas that emerges from these two responses is the idea that genes can give rise to a particular outcome, that genetic expression we might call the phenotype. Okay? Well, it might be the case that there's one mechanism inside of this room that we would call a human being that is responding to questions and slipping out answers underneath the door. But there also could be an intelligent machine that's slipping out answers under the door. And if you're the person receiving the answers and the answers are working for you, we're getting the same kinds of phenotypes, even though we might have wildly different genotypes in here, right? One might be a human answerer, and one might be a machine-based answerer. And Turing was saying, well, maybe all we really care about is what's functioning for you as a recipient of that information. Whether it came from a machine or whether it came from a human doesn't really matter. Okay? All right. So we're almost at 1, but I did want to go through a couple of other questions because there's one really fun thought exercise I wanted to link to this. The idea of a luminance edge. It might be very straightforward, but some students through the years have stumbled over the idea of a luminance edge and why they might be important to visual perception theory. So anybody want to help us out with what it is and why it might be important? What is a luminance edge? Or can you point to one in the room? Can you point to a luminance edge? Okay. Jake's pointing to something. Okay, all right, so you might say that this is a type of an edge, or you might say that this is a type of an edge. You might think of it this way. We can think of a luminance edge, and maybe this is worse, maybe this helps, maybe this doesn't help. You can think of a luminance edge as a luminance discontinuity, okay? And I'll unpack that for us. A luminance discontinuity. So what do I mean by that? Luminance discontinuity. Let's pretend that my pen here is a light meter. Okay, so my pen is a light meter, and it's just counting the number of photons that are coming in it. And so I'm going to point my
light meter right about here, and I'm going to capture a certain number of photons. I can move over to here, I'll capture a certain number of photons. I can move, and I'm basically getting a constant level of photons if I'm taking this little patch, 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 and then all of a sudden I'm here. What happens to my photomic reading? Does it go up or down? And then go from here to here? How many more or fewer photons coming from black than from white? Fewer photons, okay, so it's many fewer photons, it's a lot darker. The level of luminance has changed here. Okay? We've gone from a relatively high level to a relatively low level, light to dark. Okay? That's all we mean by an edge, and Jake was correct to point to just about any edge in the room. It's almost hard not to point to an edge, but you might say that right in here we don't have an edge, here we don't have an edge. The word edge contains this D. That D itself has a luminance discontinuity. Here's a vertical decrement in luminance embedded in a much whiter surround or a brighter surround. Okay? All right, so that's the idea. Now, why does that matter? Okay? I'd like to say just a little bit about that. It turns out that if we are going to have these metabolically expensive eyes, they're going to help us move around the world, and we're going to need to know such things as like, where do we step? Right? Certain steps would be better than other steps. Imagine that you're trying to cross from one side of a river to another across a very, very thin bridge. Okay? And you've got a bridge to walk across that's only very narrow, and if you misstep, you go all the way down. Okay? You can imagine that maybe that bridge hypothetically is fairly dark. Right? Maybe it's a darker color, like a dark wood color bridge, and the water underneath you might be quite reflective of light. Okay? So now we've got a nice luminance edge, a luminance discontinuity, that's kind of showing us where we can step. Okay? And we can take advantage of that information to make it to the other side of the river, to maybe find a mate, or to find food, or something along these lines. So figuring out where the edges are really helps to promote where we should move. Okay? A very Gibsonian idea. And what I'd like to share with you is this thought exercise that Gibson gave us many, many years ago. I think it's really an important one. So he asks us to imagine that we're in this room, and all of a sudden we turn it into a sauna, and we allow the fog to come in. And so now we've got this fog rolling in, and it gets thicker and thicker and thicker. And what we notice is that we can't even see the hand right in front of us. We know that we're waving our hand, but I can't see the hand. All I can see is this really thick fog. Everything looks kind of white. If I were to go over to the lights inside of the sauna and turn them down and turn them up, you could probably correctly report that it got darker and it got lighter. Okay? So there's a sense in which you have very general information about the overall light level. But you wouldn't have any solid information about how to reach out and grab a particular object. Right? There's no edge information that you can use to pick out one object or maybe to walk across a particular path in that room. Okay? So the point that he makes is that the visual system does something like it picks up luminance edges. It doesn't just catch photons like our photoreceptors do, as we talk about in Intro to Psych. We know that we have long wave, medium wave, and short wave photoreceptors that catch light. They do that. But it's not just what they do. The retina does something much more than that. It picks up luminance edges that inform us, they reduce uncertainty about where things are. So we have plenty of photons in that sauna. There's no absence of light, but there's a tremendous absence of information. Right? We don't know where the pens are, we don't know where the letters are, we don't know where to step. Okay? So his point is maybe we need to be thinking about what kinds of information we're picking up, not just about what kinds of energy in terms of photons and photoreception that might be going on in the early visual stages. So the luminance edge turns out to play an important role. Okay, I'm going to stop right there because I do want to give you a few minutes to first practice. Practice for the exam that we have coming up. And I'll ask you to spend about maybe 4 minutes or so developing test questions that you would ask your partner. And in a few minutes, I'll ask you to get together with your partner, and you'll kind of quiz each other, okay? And the very act of thinking through what we've been doing for the last 3 weeks and having to pull all that out of memory and generate a question is really a great exercise. So maybe you can develop a question or two. I'll give you 3 or maybe 4 or 5 minutes to think it through by yourself. And then after 4 or 5 minutes, I'll ask you to pair with somebody, and you can quiz each other and see if you're coming up with questions that are helpful to one another. And then maybe we'll spend the last couple of minutes of class sharing them broadly with one another. Okay, so a couple of minutes to yourself, to think about questions that you would ask another student to test their knowledge. This may help you on projecting the portion of the syllabus that we've covered so far. I might jog your memory about different topics. realize you might be mid-sentence, go ahead and finish your thought. And then when you're set, maybe you can find a partner, and you can be in a trio if that works better for you, but smaller groups tend to be best. And we always think of these kinds of sessions as when I teach, I learn. We learn a lot by quizzing each other and trying to figure out what might be a challenging but approachable question or achievable question for somebody who's similarly situated to you. It's very metacognitive, trying to think about what somebody else might know and how to test their knowledge about that. So when you're set, spin around. It's okay if it gets loud in here. We'll spend a few minutes chatting one person to the next, sharing our questions, and then we'll see if we can spend the last couple of minutes just sharing questions with the wider group. Go ahead.
I'm ready.
Okay, why don't we try to come back together? We have only a couple of minutes. I feel bad about breaking up the party. Yeah, this thing just started to take off. What a blast it is for me to hear like the stream of consciousness. I'm hearing little pieces of information that we talked about, in week 1 or week 2, and you hear this little blip that rings a bell for me. And so it's really fun for me to hear about this. Anybody want to share a question? And we'll see how the group responds to it. A question that you developed, or maybe a question that your partner developed? We don't even have to answer it as a group. I'm more interested in what questions may have been generated. Okay, thanks, Liz. Thank you.
I had a really good question about PSE, and our group had kind of a hard time explaining the purpose of PSE.
Yeah. What is the purpose of PSE? Well, okay, Gabby's got something, yeah.
I always think of it as like how you're calibrated.
Wonderfully stated, okay? And that makes sense to me, and that would get full credit had that been, but maybe not all of us understand what you mean by how you're calibrated. And you gave a great gesture, how you're calibrated, yeah, right, okay? So the PSE tells us about how we're calibrated.
Yeah.
Do you want to say a little bit more about that?
So if you're calibrated very accurately, you would be, half of your answers would be yes or no, so you'd be right at 0.
Yeah, okay.
Some people are biased towards saying one or the other,
okay.
So they might be calibrated a bit towards the left or the right.
Okay, right. So to the extent that they're biased, they might be miscalibrated one way or the other, and we can quantify those things. Okay, all right. So that was a good question and a very good answer. Some others, even if we don't have answers, is trying to form the questions is a great metacognitive practice for us. Some other questions that came up. Okay, Sora's got something.
In the first week, is consciousness evolutionary?
Okay, is consciousness evolutionary? And then what is the hard problem of consciousness? Okay, well, yeah, great. We come back to those a couple of times. So according to our author, Nick Lane, he thinks that that consciousness is very strongly rooted in evolution, and that fundamentally, one of my favorite lines from that chapter, fundamentally, consciousness is about life and death. It's such a succinct statement and such a bold statement, but I think he's probably right. Okay. All right. Some other questions that people developed. How are we doing? Maybe we have time for one more. Why don't we have Tani get the last word?
In signal detection theory, what is D-prime measuring?
Okay. In signal detection theory, what is D-prime measuring? And we all had an intuition about that when we were using Meg's excellent example about Facebook being fooled by the sisters, the twin sisters. I have 3 brothers, by the way. One of my brothers, people tell me, looks very much like me. We are not twins, but it would be really fun for me to figure out whether we fool Facebook or not. We fool a lot of our relatives. Many of our relatives can't keep us straight. We'll see if Facebook does any better. Okay. So thank you for your creativity. Really appreciate your thoughts on that, and look forward to our exam on Friday. And then we get to learn all about the human eye during next week, and a great chapter by Richard Dawkins. Okay? So I'll see some of you in a little while, and I'll see the rest of you on Friday.